Welcome to the Ownership Economy Podcast, the podcast that explores the people and ideas that are utilizing technology, economics, and the law to reimagine how the economy can work for everyone. Here we connect with the entrepreneurs, investors, thought leaders, academics, and politicians that are constructing the ownership economy by expanding access to broad-based ownership and democratic governance. I'm Martin Smith, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jahed. We are two investors and operators that aim to use this platform to showcase the people and ideas that will shape a society that offers more economic opportunity for all. Today, John and I talked with Jeff Emmett. It was a highly informative hour with a researcher that is at the heart of innovation and organizational design. Jeff's current work takes inspiration from Nobel Prize-winning economist and sociologist Elinor Ostrom. So we start off with Ostrom and who she was and what her contribution was to today's architects of the new digital commons. We then dig into some of the primitives or digital Lego blocks that make up this new commons. We talk about bonding curves and the importance of driving liquidity for new tokens. We consider alpha bonds, which could bring greater accountability and efficiency to impact investing. And we finish off with the concept of conviction voting, which could build more engaged and inclusive democracies. We hope you enjoy the pod.
All right. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. Maybe you could start by giving our audience a bit of an intro to you as a person, your background in tech and otherwise.
Sure, absolutely. So my formal education background is as an electrical engineer. I did a bachelor's at University of Waterloo in Canada. After engineering, I started engineering with a heavy interest in computers and not so heavy interest in people. And I finished my degree with the opposite. So I kind of went from engineering into the world of digital marketing, and particularly in travel and tourism. I spent a number of years traveling around Southeast Asia, South Africa, Central America, and got really interested in people and didn't really see my return to engineering until I discovered blockchain. I was kind of exploring around at, it was right around the time of, this kind of right-wing populist movements around the world and, climate change and this sort of disillusion of truth as a shared understanding. And kind of, I was like, what is going on in the world? And really came across blockchain. And I remember I had a eureka moment in my garage where I was just kind of running around the house going, it's blockchain, it's gonna do so much. And of course, it's only a tool, but that really kind of sparked my return to engineering because I found this token engineering space, which was still very new. And I think there's a massive opportunity to bring over established tools from, electrical engineering, systems engineering, control theory into social signal processing systems. So I'm really interested in how we can use the same tools for, multi-agent dynamics in drone swarms, for example. And that's not saying humans are drones, but there are certain, design principles and safety principles in terms of designing large-scale systems, international power grids. What are blockchains, but international electronic or economic power grids? So, a lot of the same sort of like fault tolerance analyses, sensitivity testing, all these sorts of things we can bring into the blockchain world. And I just think there's so much opportunity to continue to explore this overlap between tried and tested tools, that got us to the moon, that create, the internet, a workable internet, and now applying them into the blockchain sphere. I think there's a lot of promise there.
Right. And so you said you started school very interested in computers and not into people, and that inverted by the time you were done. So what shape did some of that take, right? Because I'll tell you from my participation in some of the communities that you're involved in, the word, at least the social scientist that everyone seems to really, back out to is Elinor Ostrom, right? So how did you did you just jump right into Ostrom? Like, what was your sort of path from, I like computers and not people, to actually people?
I think it was when we were trying to figure out what exactly was the biggest problem that these tools could solve. And this was before the Common Stack even had a name. I was speaking with a number of researchers that, these aren't just solving problems of open source, and kind of going down that rabbit hole was like, well, what is open source? Open source is a public good. What are public goods? What are goods? And, coming across the matrix of private goods, club goods, common goods, and public goods. And then ultimately, stumbling across Ostrom's work and realizing that there was a massive literature in sort of these collective action dynamics. How do people govern shared resources? And ultimately, when we backed out to the largest possible view, we were like, we're building new tools for the commons. So that's where the commons stack was sort of a stack of tools that could be, used to augment collective resource sharing in the digital age. And that's where the common stack came in. That's where, I really went down the deep end of, I read Derek Wall's Ostrom's Rules for Radicals, Cooperative Alternatives but Beyond Markets and States. And I was just like, oh, cool. This, tokens are this new medium of design. Tokens are, a new silicon almost, where you can create, different rights, affordances, responsibilities, program them into these sorts of transferable assets or non-transferable, depending on the context. We have such a wide design space. So ultimately, I think that was the biggest framing we could find for what are these tools ultimately useful for.
Got it. And so you dropped a lot of terms there, and also some groups that we'll dig into a bit: common stack, token engineering, all that kind of stuff. But first, let's assume the stance of Jeff Emmett finishing at Waterloo, who's really into humans, right? Can you tell us a bit about who Elinor Ostrom was and why her work is important?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ostrom is one of the most celebrated, I think, social scientists in the study of the commons. A lot of her work was in sometime in the 50s or 60s. Garrett Hardin wrote The Tragedy of the Commons. And this was basically some attempt to say that, people left to their own devices cannot manage shared resources. He pointed to a bunch of examples of the tragedy of the free rider problem. And Elinor Ostrom basically overturned that by saying, hey, look, I've been studying and working with and examining, examples from around the world of essentially emergent collectives of people who are managing shared resources successfully without a government, without, some sort of top-down bureaucratic, control system. And ultimately I don't know if this might have been later than Ostrom, but a commons is a combination of three things. It's a community, it is a shared resource of that community, and it's the norms and processes by which that community can use those resources. So ultimately, the combination of people, resources, and tools to manage those resources is sort of this meta framing of the commons. And Ostrom's work is some of the most seminal work examining how that played out in on-the-ground communities around the world.
Got it. And then how did Ostrom's work come to play a role in these communities that not the 8 or 10 or whatever number of communities it was in real life that you sort of combined her anthropological and other approaches to, but really the communities you're involved in, right? So BlockScience, Common Stack, Token Engineering Commons. You kind of talked about, discovering this matrix and going through a lot of exercise around that. Did you then just go, hey, let's hop into Google Scholar, and we landed on Ostrom? Like, how did Ostrom's work come to play in the communities?
I think Ostrom, and I hate to simplify her work to, her 8 principles, but this is, kind of the BuzzFeed, do these 8 things and your commons will be successful. And I think that's really like that. One of the first pieces I wrote was essentially examining those principles one by one and then looking at sort of their digital equivalents. So, Ostrom's first principle is commons need to have a boundary. And it was like, oh, yeah, they do. And we can create a boundary with a token ownership. So if you hold the token, you are within the boundary. If you don't hold the token, you're outside of the boundary. So there are sort of the digital analog equivalent of Ostrom's principles. And I think that's a nice framing for how we can design these systems so that they are building on the sustainable practices that we see happening on the ground in the real world. We are kind of creating new economic realities, but if they don't reflect and utilize the real world realities that we can see and measure in the real world, then we're kind of building in, clouds in the sky or fortresses in the clouds. So I think it's really nice to have that sort of connection between these economic realities and how, digital commons versus analog commons. I think there needs to be strong bridges between those, or else we're building things that won't be sustainable in the long run.
Got it. And I think that sustainability is a good point, right? When you were talking about Garrett Hardin, right? I may not put it as strongly as you in some ways, and I'll put it stronger in others, right? Like when I talk to people about the commons, I'm like, yeah, so Elinor Ostrom, why does she matter? Well, I used to say, well, she proved Garrett Hardin wrong. It's not necessarily that. It's more that I read Garrett Hardin's work as the tragedy of the commons is inevitable it's a deterministic outcome without a state. That's roughly like the theme that he built around, right? And then there were a lot of really interesting assumptions he made. He's been accused of being a eugenicist, all that kind of stuff. We won't get into that. But what is interesting, though, is that, her work, like you said, illuminated this. I wouldn't call it a third way. I'd say it's always been there. It's just about really showing people what's possible in the commons, right? So now we have a little bit of theoretical grounding, and we're talking about tokens, assets, outcomes we want to collectively manage, and design principles that help us do that. So let's kind of maybe dig in a bit. We have that theoretical grounding. Let's jump in a little bit more, maybe into Common Stack or any of the other communities you want to, and say, if we have an asset or outcome that we want to achieve, and we're within this commons framework where we're now not just in public private, right? We're not just like, oh, well, let's start a company, or let's go to the state, or, maybe the third one could be a nonprofit, right? Something like that. How do the tools that you're working on come into play?
I think it's interesting that we're exploring this as, not this, not that, because ultimately what tokens do is really blend these polar dichotomies into spectrums, and we have this like market on one end and state on the other. But what about like market states in the middle, and I think this is where it's really interesting because tokens blend those, they're sort of they turn these polar opposites into spectrums. And then we can design, the appropriate institutional form along that spectrum where it needs to be. Some things need to be more like states. Some things need to be more like markets. But now we have a space to play in, how we set up these institutions, some of which have more democratic flair, some of which have more, plutocratic flair. And that's not to say that, there's one that's better than another. It depends on the context, depends on the use case that we're discussing. So I think that's one of the most interesting things about tokens is they create this, we move away from binary and poles and towards spectrums of design that can be much more customized to and fit to purpose.
Yeah, and I think just on that point, before we get off of Eleanor Ostrom, what I think her work did, like this 50 years or 40 years of kind of studying these communities, is it broke us out of this kind of academic framework where we had kind of neoclassical economics, right? And you had kind of the entire Chicago school that was, it's either the market or it's the state. And if it's the market, you want it to be as big a component of the economy as possible. And if you want the state, it's got to be a small component of the economy as possible into this framework where you have this spectrum, right? And then just as you said, kind of the underlying technology allows for thinking about the outcomes that you want to achieve and then designing for those outcomes.
Right. And even, embedding regulation within the market, as you say, like we have markets where, a lot of the free market ideology is like there should be no state intervention, which is absolutely ridiculous because, you wouldn't have a market without a state providing certain things like property law and, whatever, that the book of laws is that deep on free markets. But, we can start to embed appropriate and contextual regulation within those systems such that they achieve purpose outside of just financialization. I feel like our markets have gotten away from the real world, at least in terms of the stock market, Wall Street versus Main Street. They're both markets, but one exists in the stratosphere and is barely connected to the real world underneath. And I think these are new tools that we can retether, the real world economies. Everything is an economy. Nature is an economy, but finance has basically free-ridden all of these natural economies, human economies, the carbon economy, the water economy. All of these flows are now subdued to the flows of the financial economy of Wall Street. And I think that's, these are new tools by which we can rein that back into balance with our natural systems, with our social systems, and so on.
And I think just so on that point, a lot of people, when they think about crypto, they mostly think about the financial element of it. They don't think, or the layman thinks about the financial element of it, trading in and out of it quickly. Am I going to have kind of massive asset appreciation here? But that's really almost like a less interesting element of the underlying technology. And so as we dig into some of the work that you're doing at BlockScience, some of the work that you're doing with Common Stack, like tell us a little bit about some of these specific tools. And I think we should get into some of the, very particular nomenclature. And so one area that has emerged over has really kind of been an underpinning of many of these decentralized finance marketplaces are this tool called a bonding curve. So can you walk us through what a bonding curve in the simplest language possible?
Sure. And there's a couple of different types of bonding curves, and they provide different purposes. A lot of the bonding curve talk that comes about in the common stack is essentially a new collaborative funding tool. So let's say the three of us come together, we want to start a cooperative. Maybe we want to fund a podcast pool, and we all want to provide some startup capital. I mean, traditional ways to do that, you could start a business, a corporation, you could launch equity, or, in this sort of new Web3 paradigm, we could launch a bonding curve. So a bonding curve is a set of smart contracts that exist on maybe Ethereum or any protocol for that matter. And if we put our assets in, the bonding curve will generate an asset, a token, and then we can use that token to govern our new network. So it's essentially a way to create incentives for mutual investment and mutual collective steering of that organization. So you can think of it sort of like a digital institution of any different form. This could be a fundraising model for a digital cooperative or a neighborhood group, or perhaps even an intrepid corporation that was interested in exploring the benefits of Web3 and sort of like user ownership. So the bonding curve is sort of the economic substrate of these digital economies. And this would be contrasted with, most crypto space, you find a lot of hate of fiat. Fiat is just issued out of nothing, like US dollars, whatnot. Actually, most crypto tokens are also fiat. Anytime you have a pre-mint, anytime you decide, before launching a token, there's going to be 21 million Bitcoin. Who decided 21 million? Why 21 million? Why 1 billion IOTA? Why pick a number in advance? Ultimately, these bonding curves are essentially like primary issuance markets. So rather than having primary issuance event where I say I need 1 billion tokens and then I sell you one for $1 and suddenly I've created $1 billion worth of market cap value off of $1 in trade. That's not really representative of, and I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but ultimately bonding curves in the long run, I think will offer us more responsible and stronger foundations for token issuance in a range of different circumstances.
Can you talk a little bit about when a project is getting started, how these bonding curves are used? So like, how is a liquidity bootstrapped? What does that mean? And like, how does a new community or a new cooperative or a new startup kind of bootstrap liquidity into this digital institution that they want to create?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And actually, this is the key that bonding curves in all different forms have provided since 2017, 2018, actually since the end of the last bear market. I would say it actually ended because of bonding curves and liquidity pools. So ultimately, if you kind of step back and say, okay, what is a centralized exchange versus a decentralized exchange? On a centralized exchange, you have a business, maybe the New York Stock Exchange, for example, they custody their customers' money, and they maintain an order book. So a bunch of people want to buy an asset at a certain range of prices. A bunch of people want to sell an asset at a certain range of prices. And when that buy price and the sell price match, then the trade goes through. So this is what a centralized exchange does. In decentralized exchanges, there is no middleman. There's no company that's creating an order book. There's no one custodying funds. It's basically off of liquidity pools. So you have a liquidity provider comes along and provides two assets into a liquidity pool, maybe ETH and Bitcoin. And they say, look, I'm going to put $1,000 worth of ETH and $1,000 worth of Bitcoin into a smart contract. And they're just kind of sitting there in this liquidity pool. Now, whenever a trader comes along, they can deposit Bitcoin and withdraw Ether, or deposit Ether and withdraw Bitcoin. So it's kind of like a similar effect to an order book, but rather than having a company maintain an order book and custody of buyers and sellers' funds, it's all non-custodial. You do it right from your Web3 wallet, and you can just trade between these liquidity pools. And this is the key aspect of crypto tokens that didn't exist prior to 2017. I think some of the earliest protocols were Bancor, and of course Uniswap really popularized the DEX and liquidity pools, but there were all sorts of experiments before that. And the provision of liquidity was really a key property for token ecosystems, because before that, most tokens, 99% of tokens, had no daily trading volume. So you were far more likely to be stuck with the bag. If nobody wanted to buy your token, you were stuck. Now that there's liquidity pools, and there's liquidity pools between thousands of different, maybe millions of different token pairs, you can much more easily trade these tokens because there's liquidity now in the crypto ecosystem. And before bonding curves, and particularly like secondary market AMMs, like Uniswap, like Bancor, et cetera, and less, the primary issuance markets, which is the sort of the common stack augmented bonding curve model. So there's a little bit of difference between these different types of bonding curves, but ultimately what they all provide is liquidity, whether that's exchange liquidity on secondary markets or issuance and exit liquidity on a primary market.
That's really helpful. And so Jahed and I have put some money into a kind of a variety of projects that are trying to use these concepts to kind of redefine investment in public goods, redefine investment in development projects and to ESG initiatives, things like Popcorn DAO. Can you tell us a little bit? You've kind of taken this concept of bonding curves that has been around for a while, and now you're applying it in a lot of different ways to the philanthropy space, to the development finance space. Can you talk about, or you're, if not applying it, you're coming up with specific models for how it could be applied? And so it'd be great to kind of walk through some of the more intricate design systems or models that you've created both within Common Stack and BlockScience now to support institutions, digital institutions in their work in this area.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting project that BlockScience and ICSO and the Interchain Foundation have been working on around alpha bonds, or risk-adjusted bonding curves. So this is kind of a next level. So take a bonding curve. So you create some token, and then it was connected with a prediction market as sort of a social signaling process for social impact bonds. So social impact bonds, maybe I can reverse a little bit, basically to fund outcomes of any kind. Maybe let's make sure 1,000 trees are planted. Okay, so a government or a business or whoever says, yeah, if 100,000 trees are planted, I would happily pay, $250,000 for that outcome. So this is sort of a different way of framing nonprofits as delivering productive outputs to a government, to any business interested in ESG initiatives, et cetera. The issue with social impact bonds is they're typically not very transparent. So the outcomes payment is promised. Essentially, financial intermediaries provide the investment capital, knowing that if they succeed in the goal, they will get the payout. So essentially, banks or investors sort of put the upfront capital to carry out the project, and they take the risk that outcome will be achieved, because it may not, right? The project may fail. And if it fails, then there's no outcomes payment and all of those people are out of money. So what they want is essentially better risk predictors of how is this project performing? Is it reaching targets? In social impact bonds, typically these are very large, very international projects. So it's very difficult for investors to understand how much risk they're taking. And therefore they charge more for, lending the capital to these projects. Because if you don't know how risky it is, if it will succeed or fail, you have to charge more to potentially, to cover your potential losses. So ultimately, alpha bonds are trying to use crypto economic primitives like bonding curves combined with prediction markets so that you can get a better real-time risk signal of how likely this project is to succeed or not. So I think that the application of these tools has to be done very carefully. We don't want to have financial speculation on, really important things like children's education or, the restoration of our environment, et cetera. So, how these tools get applied is very different from how they're built. We've done a lot of the work modeling and making sure that essentially when you combine a bonding curve and a prediction market, things don't just blow up. It has to be done in a way that, these sort of nonlinear effects can be understood and designed to be as safe as possible. But of course, all of these tools can be deployed in the wrong context as well. So I think we have to be really careful about where we choose to deploy these tools and how we choose to deploy them. making sure that, the stakeholders that are being served are, we're not just basically extracting value from the commons to the financial sphere, for example, because that happens all the time. So ultimately, we need to think carefully about how we apply these tools and make sure that they're serving the purpose that we designed them for ultimately, because any tool could be misused.
Yeah, and where this gets really powerful is when you take this primitive that you build around something like these alpha bonds, right, for impact, and you combine that with an oracle, right? So one of the things that you might say is, well, how am I going to get real-time data on whether or not this project is successful or not? Well, you could just combine, you could think about what is a data stream that I could pull in to the oracle from the ground. You could use something like, if I'm funding preserving a forest, right, in as a carbon sink, right, and I want to make sure that that forest in Indonesia doesn't get cut down, and I'm going to pay Goldman Sachs, or I'm going to pay someone a premium to make sure that that forest doesn't get cut down, but they don't really have any role on the ground. So how do you monitor that? Normally, when you have a development project, you would hire a prime contractor, right, to essentially monitor that on the ground, or someone like a prime contractor that does monitoring and evaluation. In this sense, you could use something like, satellite imagery to see whether or not that project is actually being cut down, feed that into an oracle, and then use this primitive to pay out. And so you don't have to build everything yourself. You can use these different primitives as building blocks to essentially achieve development outcomes that are more efficient and properly calculate risk. So this is kind of an example of just how modular this market space is getting over time, and is kind of relevant to a number of the things that we've been talking about on the pod with the founder of Gitcoin, or one of the current CEO of Gitcoin, about quadratic voting. I think we want to also talk about kind of conviction voting, and as another kind of primitive that you've been working on as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is another interesting area where tokens blend between, things that look like money or equities into things that look like votes. And, having tokens act as votes is also somewhat controversial, because, we want to make sure that we aren't creating systems where the rich can just have all the say, because that's kind of the world we already live in, and we need to move. So you have to carefully design these systems, of course. And conviction voting is another attempt at, rethinking how we can vote using these new tools. So, voting traditionally, a person scratches a line on a paper, and then another person counts up all of those papers, and then we choose who is going to make the decisions based on how many rocks were scratched on how many pieces of paper. We now have a new technological substrate where tokens provide a rich temporal data stream of information. So, if you think of society as a social signal processing system, the inputs from the citizens are essentially guiding the direction of this societal ship that we're all on. And right now, we only take one bit from those constituents every 4 years. This is way too slow. My Nintendo has better processing power than that. So, with tokens, we can start to create real-time preference signaling systems. And this is where conviction voting comes in. So with conviction voting, you don't vote on Thursday, at the voting place. You can vote anytime from your home computer. So you can allocate your tokens towards any proposal that is currently on the table. And the way this is commonly used right now is for funding decisions. So let's say in our theoretical, we've created a bonding curve. The three of us, we want to create a podcast. Well, we don't know what our first podcast should be on. I think it should be on topic A. You think it should be on topic B. Someone else thinks it should be on topic C. Cool. Now all of those proposals are on the table, and everyone who holds those tokens can vote at any time. And your conviction grows the longer you hold your preference. So you can think of it like each person is a tap. And there's a bunch of buckets that you can pour your preference into. So your preference fills up the buckets. And of course, everyone is their own tap. So these buckets are filling up with the aggregated conviction of everyone in your community. And then when the bucket fills up, those funds are released for that proposal. So this actually mimics how distributed decision-making works in nature, like in neurons in the brain. Neurons communicate through firing the synapses, and energy potentials grow. And when more synapses fire, the energy potential grows faster. And then this is how information propagates through a neuronal network. So this is kind of similar if you kind of take a step back, and each human in the system is their own neuron. They're they're pouring their conviction or their preference towards certain proposals. And then when that proposal hits sufficient support in the community, funds are released and work can begin. So this is, I think, a really important tool for DAOs today, because right now, when you're in a DAO and you hold tokens, it's just information overload. You have to vote on everything. You have to vote on everything from, paying the janitor to, how do we invest to get this institution in the direction that we want it to go? And it's just overwhelming for people. So conviction voting is really a tool to kind of increase subsidiarity in a DAO, where you can have a smaller group within a large DAO funding their own proposals without someone on the far end of the organization who has no idea what's happening over here needs to vote on that. So it's really sort of a way for more localized decision making, which I think will be really important as DAOs grow and start to creak against, old voting tools like ad hoc voting and one-off non-temporal voting systems.
And that's actually super fascinating. What do you think about its application to like everyday citizens of any old state or neighborhood, community, council? Because basically, we've talked about a lot of different voting systems on the show so far. We talked about quadratic voting. You might have made reference to ranked choice, all that kind of stuff. But then if you look at something like even the completely nauseating 4-year election cycle that those of us who are Americans are becoming more and more used to, it's optimizing for certain things, right? Like the campaign war chests are, not exponentially increasing, but really going up, 20, 30% every time. They're in the billions of dollars now because people are looking at, well, what works? Oh, ad networks, particular campaigns, paying this much person that much, starting, using some guerrilla tactics, whatever, right? And there's a sea bullshit around disinformation and everything that everyone has to wait under. And so what are your thoughts really on conviction voting and its promise, maybe against some things like disinformation, a better educated populace? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment as well. Your mention of quadratic voting is really interesting. And I'm also interested that these tools can be combined. You could have quadratic conviction voting. You could have continuous ranked choice voting. It's really opens up the design space into how we can use tokens on this new substrate of blockchains, which are, continuously operating. And I think what they offer for democracy is the relocalization of decision making. And I think that's really important. I think the nation state has, it serves important functions, but ultimately it's been captured by, financial interests, by the lobbying interests, by, attention cycles. And I think it's just gotten too big. I remember, wondering, I was looking into e-voting, like, why can't we all vote from our computers? Hundreds of trillions of dollars are moved digitally in a year. Like, there's no issue with security in terms of like using computers for votes. But the issue is an election, like a presidential election, is just too big a honeypot. It's deciding who will make all the decisions for the next 4 years. There's just such a concentration of power in that one moment that, essentially no e-voting system will ever be quote unquote secure enough, because, anyone who can hack that one moment can hack the next 4 years. And I think we really need to break that down a bit. Like, we need to relocalize decision making. And you see things like, citizen assemblies or participatory budgeting. It's things like that. But all of those sort of experiments never have teeth. Our governments will convene a citizens assembly and ask, what do you think is reasonable COVID policy? And they'll come back with a really good, reasonable COVID policy. And then they'll say, oh, that's not politically feasible. Sorry, we can't do that. And it's like, what? Wait a second. Like, these people are coming up with really great ideas, but then they lack the ability to follow through with them. And I think this is essentially a way that we can fractalize our democracy, and not in a bad way. We can relocalize the decision making closer to the people that are affected by those decisions. Because, having a federal government decide something 6,000 kilometers away that is completely different from my context, even from the West Coast to the East Coast, needs vary quite a bit. And I think we can, with these tools, start to explore better subsidiarity of decision making and more locally aligned incentives for good decisions at all levels of democracy.
Got it. And I think I've always been a pretty staunch critic of majoritarian voting to begin with, just because, as Americans and a lot of us in the West, we're just kind of, oh, democracy, we fought for it. It was the evolution from monarchy and feudalism and what have you. But like, there are a lot of really bad things can happen with majoritarian voting only, which is why we have, America's not a democracy, it's a republic, right? Minority rights, etc. But maybe if we look at, you mentioned subsidiarity, you mentioned opening up design spaces, right? I think moving away from majoritarian voting, right? What does that look like, right? Because like I can think of a couple examples, but I'm curious to think of, for instance, let's do maybe we look at the local, community, right? When when you talk to the average person, maybe about voting, it's like, well, if it was 51% to 49% or what have you, right? Then you go with the side that won with the most. It's what most people want. But conviction voting captures a different type of thing, right? Like you can actually, when you say fractalized voting, can you give us a concrete example of what it means to maybe have sufficient support or that you can now act on because you measured it, stuff like that?
Sure. Well, and I think it's interesting when we start to combine these primitives, when you have, for example, a bonding curve as a collective funding interface, this is what people put their money into. And then the token that's generated can then be used in conviction voting. So first of all, we're pooling our money, and then we're deciding where that pooled money goes. And that's very different from the nation state taxation system, right? You give them money and then they decide where it goes. Oh, $1 trillion for infrastructure. Yeah, well, we're going to spend 10 trillion on war first. We don't have money to rebuild our infrastructure or make sure people are taken care of, but we have plenty of money for bombs and tanks. Like we just don't have the ability to decide collectively where we want to allocate our resources. And I think that's ultimately the biggest problem, that conviction voting really builds a closer feedback loop to, okay, you're putting money into this digital institution. How do you want that money to be spent? And again, there's a lot of ways to do that. Not saying that, we should totally eliminate taxation systems and move to, conviction voting only, but I think it will be a really nice complement. And I think that complement will grow in use and in volume over time. And I think it'll, ultimately, I don't think we're building against governments. I think governments will want to use these tools because ultimately they should be sort of mimicking the flows that these are signal processing and estimation tools. When you can sample your population and see what they want, what they need, and then augment and support that, as opposed to, governments up till now have been flying blind. They don't necessarily know what's happening on the ground because they're 6,000 kilometers away on the other side of the country. So I think when we start to relocalize, how we allocate and spend shared resources, which is the essence of the commons, we can really start to explore, giving people and communities more decision-making over their own future and where their values lie.
Got it. And then, so like, this is, for me as the poster, I mean, I don't know how much of a poster you are, Jeff, but as the poster of the group on Twitter and what have you, this is kind of like the optimistic solar punk version, right? Where it's like, hey, we have a way of aggregating preference. We have a way of allocating resources. We have a way of using new information processing mechanisms to do this more efficiently, not perfectly, just maybe more efficiently. Do you folks think a little bit about what is the dark version of this? Like, what happens if these tools go out there and they're used not for this, right? Maybe not to paint too much of an, to put a flag on it, but people think of like the Chinese social credit system, all that kind of stuff. And so, what do you think about that side of it?
For sure. And, I don't think there's a tool that has been created that can't be used for evil. Even something like a shovel, sure, dig a hole, or, dig a hole and then smack someone over the head and put them in the hole. Like there's any tool can be misused. Absolutely. And, there's a lot of people that confront us with that, well, what about the Chinese social credit system? And my response is usually, if we don't build this in the open such that it's democratic and open and useful, it will be built by oppressive, top down. And not to say that any given state is meaning to be oppressive, but it comes through anyway. If we don't open these tools up to the emergent bottom-up democratic potential, then they will be used from the oppressive top-down status quo.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that's a good point because, a book that really changed my thinking on this, made me honestly the current version of myself. We'll see how long this one lasts, about 5 years, a little over 4 years actually. 2017, I finally read Seeing Like a State from James C. Scott. So we'll put that in the show notes. But I think this is a great, example of the political economy, but the political economic analysis that he did, right? Looking at the 20th century and the big state-based projects. You don't emerge from that book thinking that anyone was trying to do evil, right? Like the book's main point is that there are, I'm not a philosopher of science here, but there are other ways, other epistemologies, but the two he talks about are, of course, techne and what he calls metis, which is practical knowledge. And when a state has as Max Weber said, the right to do violence on its behalf and control a population, it simplifies to the point of like, well, let's, how much resources do we have? How many people do we have, et cetera? How do we optimize these variables? And that's just what bureaucrats do. And it's not to say that they're bad or good, but giving them tools to aggregate preference, to make things more legible, it's still on the table to see if that actually leads, what does that actually look like? Is it better? And I would say it's probably worth trying. Don't cancel me, everybody. But so
Well, yeah, but also on that point, Judd, I mean, just like, I wonder to the extent that in the US government, they're looking at this, right? Or in the EU government saying, like, look, this is pretty powerful as a tool for us to drive competitive innovation through these decentralized tools and these primitives that are developing over time, or if they're just not thinking about it in that way, right? They're just looking at kind of the financial element of this. But I have to think that there is a group of people that is influencing the US federal government and the EU around this to say, like, look, this is an area of sustained competitive advantage against China, and you should not crack down on this anytime soon.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why, that's why I participated in the Common Stack Trusted Seed. It's why, like, I've been a big fan of everything you all have been doing. And with the last little bit here, maybe we'll wrap up on, you mentioned a lot of things that this is not your fault, right? This is just the jargon of our space, right? We talked about prediction, we talked about oracles, prediction markets, verifiability, bonding curves, conviction voting, right? So let's try to summarize this maybe with a real world scenario, right? What's near and dear to our hearts, especially as people who invest and contribute to projects, is expanding. It's what the podcast is all about: expanding access to governance technologies so that we can kind of bring more folks into the fold who can then benefit from the upside that's produced from these governance and coordination technologies. So one of the things that really caught my eye in looking at your past work and then hearing your talk here is these predefining outcomes, incentivizing output, right? The current system, in a lot of ways, like you said, there's a number of examples, but the pre-purchase carbon credit market where folks are trying to regenerate land, people are, shit out of luck in a lot of ways for doing that stuff. If it's below a certain threshold, it's impossible to finance. And then, of course, there's layers and layers of bureaucracy, market makers in the middle that can't take their cut. So then if I'm looking at something like the combination of tools that you've talked us through on the podcast, maybe you pick one or two. Tell us, like, what is the area that people should focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of R&D in the space. Actually, I would say everything going on right now is R&D. We're still so early. There are certain tools that have found product market fit in certain niches, absolutely. But I think for, global adoption or even like mainstream adoption, we still need a lot of this jargon. The jargon needs to be, there's something different from selling a car that a user can get in and they can just use it. We're not quite at that point yet. We're still designing the combustion engine. A lot of these papers you're reading about bonding curves, they've got math that no normal person should have to comprehend. They've got terms that no normal person should have to comprehend. And the technology is just still that new that we're still talking about, hey, wait, we can design a combustion engine. We're selling the car, but we're still designing the combustion engine. So it's not quite so easy for people to just jump in the driver's seat and use these tools yet. There's a lot of cognitive overhead in having to understand what these tools are. What are these concepts? What is this mathematics? And so I think this just shows how early we are. We're still in the 80s, the internet era. There was no browser in the 80s. There was no email in the 80s. It wasn't usable, but the internet was 30 years old. Or, the concept of the internet was started in the 50s and really didn't gain prominence until the 90s. So I think this technology, we need to give a bit of sort of context that, it's not ready for mass scale adoption. The shadow side of the tools is rampant. It's far more like hyper capitalism now than it is like digital commons. Absolutely. Speaking of the shadow side of the tools, and I think this is where a lot of nation state governments are currently looking, is like, hey, can we let these financial casinos just run amok like this? Like, they're dangerous to people who are investing, and do we need to put financial rules on them? I don't think they're looking at them as, or maybe I shouldn't say they're not, because some people may be, but they're probably looking at them more as financial token casino games rather than new tools for localized democracy. But I think once they recognize what they can be used for, governments will be a huge ally. We could potentially tokenize and platformize different public goods that are currently offered by nation state governments and run those as public goods commons or DAOs that have for once sufficient funding. And I mean, this is obviously big statements, and I'm talking years or decades down the line. But I think ultimately what these tokens offer is the potential to move past cooperation based on force due to a nation state and creating like win-win-win positive sum network dynamics that can really move us towards the Byzantine generals problem, but for funding public goods. This is kind of the core worth looking up in the Bitcoin literature, the Byzantine generals problem. And I think ultimately, if we can create these tools in such a way that they create win-win-win dynamics for people, profit, and planet, then we're talking about a new way that we could potentially organize as a species. And I think there's a lot to explore there. I'm pretty excited about it.
And I think that's probably a good spot to wrap on. And before you go, that we always give everyone this opportunity, please shill whatever your wares are to our listeners, and we'll put some of them in the notes as well, in the show notes. But yes, please shill. Tell us where to find you on the internet and what you're working on.
Totally. Most of my research comes out through my Twitter at Jeff Emmett. I work on a number of different projects between BlockScience, token engineering. CAD is a simulation and modeling tool for complex adaptive systems. The Common Stack, of course. Token Engineering Commons is one of the first applications of the Common Stack toolkit towards funding public token engineering public goods. So there's a massive, opportunity to get involved in a lot of these different groups. I think there's so much potential, and really, really exciting times. So excited to chat with you guys and see where this goes.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff. I'm certainly personally looking forward to what comes out of Impact Alpha Bonds and thinking through, what happens when you bring this ownership economy to social impact and outcomes we all want. Super excited about that. Thanks for sharing it with us, man. Much appreciated.
For having me.
My girl gave me a bolt cutter.